Hey everyone, here is the SNES Classic once again with USB host modification. Hooked up obviously to my television here. I'm just going to get you in the tripod to make things a little bit more stable. So what we've got on screen right now, let's see if I can just raise this a little bit. There we go. So what we've got on screen right now is the SNES Classic menu with several icons on there. You can see the folders. What I'd like to show you is the NES Classic firmware running via USB host. And to do this, we simply hit A. And that's it. It's running the NES Classic firmware via the SNES Classic. All the games are on there, including a link to jump back to the SNES Classic. So to go back to the SNES Classic firmware, we simply click on that and back we go. Obviously on the Super Nintendo side, I've got lots of different emulated consoles. But here we go, NES Classic Edition into the firmware. And in there we've got the usual things. Last time, I guess, I've seen this. What's that say there? You're getting the C7 errors. Ouch. Yep, I feel the pain there. The only thing I can suggest you do with any kind of errors, whether it's C7, C8, or I think I've seen C5 or C6 errors, is basically go back to the very, very start. Start over again, but only put one additional game on the console. I know it sounds silly, but it's about keeping down to basics until you've kind of got the methods off the top of your head. Happens to me all the time. Earlier on today, I noticed that Kyle and Kay had released a new USB host. Sure enough, I did the same thing I normally do, and it didn't work. So again, I had to go back, cut everything down, only putting one game on at a time. And eventually I found out what the problem was. It was the fact when I was going back to factory firmware, the latest Dan the Man export doesn't actually allow you to then flash the SNES Classic with custom. There's something wrong with it, so I had to use an older version. But again, it's just about keeping things very, very simple. So anyway, on with this one. So all the games are in there. This is the NES Classic firmware, but unlike the last time I showed you this, we now have it running full color. The last time I showed you, I think it was all black and white, and that was purely one of these issues that you get when you you flash it. Again, these are untested, non-Nintendo certified modifications. The guys that are doing this, Mad Monkey, obviously he was the original USB host author. Kyle and Kay took that up, and Kyle and Kay's taken it to a next level, actually trying to give regular updates. Dan the Man's now doing modifications to Hackchi 2. Dan the Man's doing an absolutely fantastic job. But again, this is all work in progress, guys. Don't think that you can just do this if you're a novice. You've really got to spend some time and effort actually getting things working properly. Even for myself, who I've been doing it since early November, it's still incredibly fiddly, incredibly difficult, and it is tedious, and it will... it's going to make you say a few swear words. Many a time I've been sat there for hours trying to work out what the heck was wrong. If possible, always have a couple of SD cards or memory sticks, because sometimes it could be just as simple as you've done something wrong on the SD card. Actually, I'm just thinking about those C6 and C7 errors. What you might want to do is have a look on the SD card in your Hackchi folder. If you have a saves directory, as much as it pains you to, delete the contents or remove them and put them somewhere else. But just have an empty saves folder, because sometimes when the Nintendo Classic starts up, it will actually look and try. The USB host obviously uses something in that folder, and sometimes it gets its knickers in a twist. It just gets something wrong, or there's some file in there that's corrupted, or the configuration isn't quite right. So what you really want to be doing is looking in that saves folder, making sure it's empty when you actually start up afresh. So again, I have the down and select method of restarting here. It works absolutely fine. All the NES Classics work in there, and I actually made my own icon and put it inside the H mod for this. Go back to the Super Nintendo Classic, because I think the original icon was a little bit poor. So I've created my own icon there to go back. But when we go back to the Super Nintendo, it's just as you'd expect it to be. This is all customizable. If you look at the icons along the bottom of the screen there, you can see there's just enough so that when it wraps around nice at the bottom. If I do remove, I'm going to turn off the Nintendo now, and I'm just going to put There we go, just going off. I'm taking out the USB memory card or whatever, so I've got that just there. But when you switch it back on, it will then launch the internal firmware or the internal games that you've got on there. So for me, what I did is I actually just kept the stock games, but I also put the NES Classic Edition on the internal firmware as well. So as you can see, I have it both on the external and the internal. And believe it or not, it's only on the system once. The USB host actually launches it from the internal firmware. The NES Classic firmware is stored on the SNES. There are other ways actually to launch the NES firmware. One of them is putting the actual firmware file that you can get. I think it's the one that was extracted from the original, but you can put that firmware in a firmware folder in the Hakchi folder, and if you're using the latest USB host, it will actually boot to that firmware file. Make sure you only put one firmware file in there at a time, but it will boot to it. So if you want a Super Famicom firmware, you can boot to that instead. Obviously, that bypasses any of the USB games that you've got on there. And thinking about it, I think Kyle and Kay says you have to remove the games folder as well. So I would just rename the games folder when you want to boot directly to firmware, just from the firmware file itself on the USB drive. Just to show you that working, actually, I think I'll give it a go. So let me just transfer you now to the PC. Apologies. So we'll take you over here, and this is my my Surface Pro. So we're going to plug in the memory card, like so, and then we'll just wait for that to be recognized by Windows. It's usually a few seconds. Okay, so it's telling me here it's been recognized, and I'll just continue. So what I want to show you is my Hakchi folder. The GUI really is the Dan the Man export package there, and of course all the games that I have are in the Games SNES folder. But we'll go back to the Hakchi folder here, and we'll look at the firmware. Now I have some Japanese firmware in here, and I've labelled them. You can rename them to whatever you want, and I'm just going to copy that there, and then I will put it in a firmware folder. Apologies for the camera work while I'm typing these in. So as you can see, I've made a firmware folder. I'm not sure whether we have to rename the games anymore. I know that Kyle and Kay does a lot of updates. Maybe we don't have to rename the games folder. So just let's see what happens now. So we're taking the Japanese firmware. We'll put it in the firmware folder in the Hakchi directory on the USB. I've still got my games folder present. So what I'll do now is I'll eject this and take it over to the SNES Classic. Now, I'm just going to turn it off and then plug it into my USB host. It's very dark back there. And switch it back on. So what I'm looking for now is the Japanese Super Nintendo firmware, or the Japanese Super Famicom firmware. And I'm wondering whether or not it will read the games folder or ignore it. So as you can see, what we have now is the Japanese firmware, just because I've put it in the firmware folder. But of course, we've still got access to all of the usual things in there that I would have had previously. I can still switch to the NES Classic. Fingers crossed I can anyway. Yeah. And then I can switch back. So it looks like the firmware folder now, once you've put a firmware in there, that's just the basis, that's just your tabletop for all of your games that you may have on there. So I'm just going to go to one of these now. Again, I'm just making sure that the basics work, such as the Super Nintendo game, so I'll just launch Busby. and that seems absolutely fine. So it's up to you how you want to use this type of USB host mod. It's really nice because, as you can see, I didn't have to plug in the Super Nintendo in order to make those changes. It was just messing with the SD card or the USB memory stick. Very simple to do. Have a look at Kyle and Kay's channel. Very useful guy, along with Mad Monkey, Dan the Man, and many other contributors towards this scene. We haven't seen Cluster M in a while. He's had some time off over the last few months, but hopefully when he gets back to the scene, he can help improve Hakchi 2 so that this USB host can just be a simple modification that you click on, and you don't have to go through 2 pieces of software, sometimes 3 pieces of software to get things working. Anyway, this has been TuboMon UK. If you like the video, that'll be great. Give it a thumbs up. If you subscribe, that'll be fantastic. If you want to share the video, that's great as well. I appreciate these videos are very much thrown together very quickly. This is just for pure laziness reasons. I don't have to edit the video. I just show you what I want to show you and then jump away in and out. That's the quickest way to do things. Thanks very much. Have a good day.